The classroom on Prometheus 7 station hummed with the quiet energy of students from a dozen different worlds. Jake Mitchell sat in the third row, trying to make himself as small as possible in his chair. Around him sat beings that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. A Vexian with blue crystalline skin tapped notes on a datapad with 3 fingers. 2 Kryllian students whispered to each other in clicks and whistles that the translation implant in his ear converted to understandable speech. At the front of the room, Professor Velric paced back and forth on his scaled legs, while his tail swished behind him with each step. The professor was lecturing about extinct species, and today, the focus was on Earth. Jake had been dreading this lecture all week. He knew what was coming, and he knew it was going to be awkward. Sure enough, the holographic display above the professor flickered to life and showed the image of a gray wolf standing on a snowy ridge with its head tilted back in mid-howl. Professor Velric gestured at the image with one clawed hand, and his voice carried the practiced sadness of someone who had given this lecture many times before. The gray wolf, he said, was one of the great tragedies of Earth, an apex predator that had roamed northern continents for hundreds of thousands of years. An intelligent social creature that lived in family groups called packs. They had complex communication systems and raised their young cooperatively, and shaped entire ecosystems through their presence. And humanity, he continued, had driven them to extinction in 2089. Classroom filled with the soft sounds of sympathy. Several students turned to look at Jake with expressions that ranged from pity to poorly concealed judgment. The Vexian next to him, whose name was Thoris, leaned over and whispered that it must be hard to learn about his people's mistakes. Thoris meant well, but Jake felt his jaw tighten. He stared down at his datapad and tried to tune out the lecture. Professor Velric was now showing images of wolf packs hunting elk in places called Yellowstone and the Canadian Rockies. He explained how wolves had been systematically hunted by human settlers who saw them as threats to livestock and to human safety. Bounties were placed on their heads. Entire packs were poisoned. By the mid-20th century, wolves had been eliminated from most of their historic range. There was a brief recovery period, the professor noted. Some conservation efforts in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But ultimately, human expansion and climate change had finished what the hunters started. The last confirmed wild wolf died in a facility in Alaska in 2089. Genetic samples were preserved, of course, but the species itself was gone. Another victim of humanity's reckless adolescence as a civilization. Jake felt something move in his backpack at his feet. He quickly pressed his boot against the bag and felt a slight whine building from inside. Not now, he thought desperately. Just a few more minutes and class would be over. He could make it back to his quarters without anyone noticing. He had been so careful for 3 weeks, sneaking food from the cafeteria and taking late-night walks in the cargo bay levels where no one went. He had been certain he could keep this secret until the end of the semester. The wolf pup in his backpack had other ideas. Professor Velric continued his lecture, displaying images of empty forests and explaining how ecosystems had collapsed without their apex predators. He talked about the concept of trophic cascades and how the loss of wolves had led to overpopulation of prey species, which led to overgrazing, which led to erosion and loss of biodiversity. It was, he said, a perfect example of how removing one species could unravel an entire web of life. A few students asked questions. Adrelian wanted to know if Earth had any large predators left at all. Professor Velric admitted that a few species survived in limited numbers, but nothing with the ecological impact of the wolf. Another student asked if humans felt guilty about these extinctions. The professor gave Jake an uncomfortable glance before saying that modern humans generally acknowledge their ancestors' mistakes even if they came Too late to fix them. Jake was barely listening anymore because the movement in his backpack was getting more insistent. He could feel scratching against the fabric. A cold nose pressed against his ankle through a gap in the zipper. This was bad. This was very bad. He tried shifting his position to block the bag from view, but that only made things worse. A soft whimpering sound emerged from the backpack. It was quiet enough that maybe no one would notice over the professor's voice. Jake coughed loudly, trying to cover it. Doris glanced at him with concern and asked if he was feeling all right. Jake nodded quickly and pointed at his throat, as if to say he just needed some water. But then the whimpering got louder. And then it became a full whine. Several students turned in their seats. Professor Velric stopped mid-sentence, and his forked tongue flicked out the way it did when he was confused or suspicious. His reptilian eyes fixed on Jake, and then dropped to the backpack at the human student's feet. The bag was moving, visibly shaking. Something was trying very hard to get out. There was no hiding it anymore. Jake felt a strange mix of dread and relief wash over him. He had known this moment would come eventually. Part of him was almost glad it was finally happening. He took a deep breath and reached down to unzip his backpack. The entire class watched in silence. As Jake opened the bag, and a small gray shape burst out with all the enthusiasm of a creature that had been cooped up for far too long. The wolf pup tumbled onto the floor, shook herself off, and immediately began exploring this exciting new environment full of interesting smells and potential friends. Luna was 5 months old, with silver-tipped fur that caught the light and made her look like she had frost on her coat. Her amber eyes were bright with intelligence and curiosity. Her ears swiveled forward and back as she took in all the new sounds. Her tail wagged so hard her entire back end wiggled with it. She bounded up to the nearest student and sniffed enthusiastically at their leg. The Krillian student shrieked and scrambled up onto their desk. Luna interpreted this as an invitation to play and barked happily while jumping up to try and reach them. Chaos erupted. Students stumbled over each other, trying to back away from the small predator. Personal shield generators hummed to life, creating shimmering barriers. Someone knocked over a chair. The Drellian student made a sound like a tea kettle and bolted for the door. Professor Velric himself had backed up against the wall, with his tail raised high in alarm, while his scales flashed through shades of red and orange. Luna thought this was the best game ever. She raced around the classroom, testing each new person to see if they wanted to play. Her claws clicked on the smooth floor. Her tongue lolled out in pure joy. When she reached Professor Velric, she sat down right in front of him and looked up with an expression that clearly said, "Hello, new friend." Jake stood up slowly with his hands raised, in what he hoped was a calming gesture. He called Luna back to him, and she obeyed immediately, trotting back and sitting at his feet while looking up at him adoringly. The classroom had gone completely silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing from panicked students. Professor Velric found his voice first, and it came out higher than usual. That he said while pointing a shaking claw at Luna is a wolf, an extinct animal, a dead species. It cannot be here because it does not exist. Jake looked down at Luna, who was now chewing on his shoelace without a care in the world. He looked back up at his professor and at all the shocked faces staring at him. He took another deep breath. Actually, Jake said wolves are not extinct at all. The silence that followed Jake's statement stretched out for what felt like an entire minute. Luna broke it by sneezing and then trying to catch her own tail. She spun in 3 circles before losing interest and flopping down on top of Jake's feet with a contented sigh. Professor Velric's scales were still flashing red, but confusion was starting to replace the alarm. The other students remained frozen in various states of defensive posture. The Vexian Thoris had both hands pressed against the desk as if ready to vault over it at any moment. A small pillion student in the back had actually climbed inside their desk compartment, and only their large eyes were visible peeking over the edge. You said the professor began and then stopped. He started again, measuring each word carefully. You said that wolves are not extinct. Jake nodded. He reached down and scratched Luna behind her ears, and her back legs started thumping against the floor in appreciation. That is correct, he said. Wolves have been off the extinction list for almost 60 years now. There are actually thousands of them across Earth. Luna here is from a breeding program in the northern Rockies. My family has been working with wolf rehabilitation for 3 generations. The holographic display still showed the frozen image of a wolf howling on a ridge. Professor Velric looked from the image to Luna and back again, several times, as if trying to reconcile what his database told him with what was currently chewing on a human student's shoelaces. But he said the records clearly state that the last wild wolf died in 2089. The species was declared extinct by your own planetary environmental agencies. Jake pulled out his datapad and began swiping through files. That declaration was made, he said, but it was reversed in 2091 when the global rewilding initiative started showing success. The last wild wolf did die in 2089, but there were still several hundred wolves in conservation facilities and breeding programs. Genetic diversity was carefully maintained. Reintroduction programs began in 2092, and by 2095, there were wild packs establishing territories again. He turned his datapad around to show a graph tracking wolf populations over the past century. The line dropped dramatically through the 2050s through 2080s, then showed a sharp recovery starting in the 2090s. Current estimates, he continued, put the global wolf population at somewhere between 15 and 20,000 individuals. They are in North America and Europe and Asia. Some of the most successful rewilding zones on Earth are built around wolf pack territories. Professor Velric's tail had stopped swishing. He took a cautious step forward, still keeping distance between himself and Luna. The pup watched him with friendly interest, but did not move from her comfortable position on Jake's feet. If this is true, the professor said, then why is the Galactic Extinction Archive still list them as extinct? Why have your people not updated the records? Jake's expression darkened. He swiped through more files on his datapad and pulled up a long list of documents. We have, he said. My mother alone has submitted update requests 17 times over the past 12 years. So have dozens of other conservationists and scientists and government environmental agencies. Every single request was rejected. He pulled up one of the rejection notices and displayed it for the class to see. The automated response stated that the update request had been flagged as statistically improbable and required verification from approved galactic sources before processing. Because Earth is still a provisional member of the Galactic Council, our scientific submissions go into a secondary review queue. And no one checks that queue. Jake continued with frustration clear in his voice. We have been trying to tell you that our data is wrong for decades. Wolves are just one example. Mountain gorillas were marked extinct in 2077, that there are currently over 5,000 of them. Bald eagles supposedly died out in 2065, but I can take you to a dozen places where you can watch them hunt fish. Giant pandas were listed as extinct in 2071, and now they are doing so well that they are no longer even considered endangered by Earth standards. The classroom had erupted into whispered conversations. Students were pulling up their own datapads and checking the extinction archive. A Krillian student raised their hand and asked how many species were incorrectly listed. Jake shrugged and said he did not have an exact number, but conservatively it was at least 200 just for Earth alone. He had no idea how many errors existed for other worlds. Professor Velric had moved closer now and was examining Luna with a mixture of scientific fascination and lingering nervousness. The wolf pup seemed to sense that the immediate chaos had passed and decided it was time to investigate this tall-scaled creature more thoroughly. She got up stretched with her front legs extended and back end raised, then trotted over to sniff at the professor's claws. Velric froze. Luna sat down and looked up at him with her tail sweeping back and forth across the floor. She made a small friendly sound that was somewhere between a whine and a grunt. After a moment, the professor slowly extended one clawed hand. Luna sniffed it thoroughly, then licked his palm with her rough pink tongue. "She is," he said softly, "very much alive." Jake walked over and Luna immediately returned to his side, pressing against his leg. "She is," he agreed, "and so are a lot of other species that your database says are gone forever." Earth went through a really dark period environmentally. We almost destroyed our own biosphere. But we pulled back from that edge. The Global Rewilding Initiative was not just about saving individual species. It was about fundamentally changing how humans interact with the rest of the living world. He looked around at the class and saw that the fear had been replaced by curiosity. Several students had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around him and Luna. He continued speaking, and his voice carried the passion of someone who had grown up immersed in conservation work. In 2065, everything changed. The old industrial agriculture system collapsed under its own weight. Too much pollution and too much resource depletion and too many crop failures. Humanity had to completely redesign how we fed ourselves. Vertical farms and lab-grown proteins and closed-loop systems freed up millions of acres of land. The Great Restoration began, and it was the largest coordinated environmental recovery effort in Earth's history. Doris asked what wolves had to do with agriculture. Jake smiled and explained that wolves became a symbol of that change. They represented wildness and ecological balance and the parts of nature that humans had tried to dominate but ultimately needed to coexist with. When wolves were reintroduced to their historic ranges, something remarkable happened. Ecosystems began healing in ways no one had fully predicted. The wolves controlled prey populations, he said, which meant vegetation could recover, which meant soil erosion decreased and water quality improved. Rivers literally changed course because beaver populations rebounded when there was more vegetation, and that created wetlands. Biodiversity exploded. Scientists called it a trophic cascade. One keystone species returning caused positive changes throughout the entire system. Luna had gotten bored with the conversation and was now attempting to chew on the leg of a desk. Jake gently redirected her, and she settled for chewing on a toy he pulled from his pocket instead. He looked at Professor Velric and said that he understood why the professor had taught what the database said. The information was supposed to be accurate. But it was not, and that was a serious problem. The professor's scales had returned to their normal green color. He nodded slowly and admitted that this was indeed a serious problem. If Earth's data was this far out of date, he said, then what about other provisional members? What about species that truly had gone extinct, but no one knew because their last survivors were not properly documented? A Drellian student suggested that maybe humans were lying. Maybe they had cloned these wolves or genetically engineered them and were trying to pass them off as the original species. Jake had expected this and pulled up genetic records showing clear lineage back to pre-extinction populations. Luna and her entire pack had genetic markers that matched preserved samples from the 2080s. There was no question of authenticity. The class continued for another 20 minutes. But the planned lecture had been completely abandoned. Students asked questions about rewilding and conservation and what other surprises Earth might have. Professor Velric took extensive notes and promised to file an urgent inquiry with the Galactic Archive Administration. Luna mostly slept through the discussion, curled up in a patch of sunlight from the viewport. When class finally ended, students crowded around Jake, asking if they could pet Luna. The wolf pup was thrilled with all the attention and gave generous kisses to anyone who got close enough. Even the pillion student who had hidden in their desk eventually came down to cautiously touch the soft fur. Jake gathered his things and put Luna back in his backpack, though she protested by going completely limp and making it as difficult as possible. As he headed for the door, Professor Velric called after him and said that this was not over. There would be questions and probably an investigation. Jake said he understood and that he welcomed it. Walking through the corridors of Prometheus 7 with Luna's head poking out of his backpack, Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. The secret was out, and instead of the disaster he had feared, it might actually lead to something good. Other students passed by and did double takes at the impossible creature riding. The next morning, Jake woke up to find that Luna had become the most famous wolf in the galaxy. His datapad had over 3,000 messages waiting, and the station network newsfeed was completely dominated by images of the impossible predator walking through the halls of Prometheus 7. Someone had recorded video of Luna in the classroom, and it had been shared millions of times across dozens of worlds. The headline on the Galactic Science Daily read, "Extinct species walks again and had humans kept this secret." Luna herself was unconcerned with her newfound celebrity status. She was more interested in the fact that Jake had slept 20 minutes past her normal breakfast time and was making her opinions about this delay very clear with a series of whines and pointed looks at her empty food bowl. After feeding Luna and taking her for a walk in the cargo bay levels where they normally exercise, Jake found a message waiting from the station administrator. He was being summoned to a formal meeting with representatives from the Galactic Council Department of Ecological Records. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and attendance was mandatory. Jake felt his stomach drop, but he had known this was coming. He sent a confirmation and began preparing what he would say. The meeting room was much larger than Jake had expected. When he arrived with Luna on a leash beside him, he found not just a few officials, but nearly 30 beings arranged around a circular table. At the head sat Director Kester, an insectoid, whose compound eyes reflected light in rainbow patterns. The director's translator voice was crisp and formal as she called the meeting to order. Jake was asked to present his evidence regarding the status of Earth's wolf populations. He had prepared for this and had spent the morning organizing files and pulling together the most comprehensive data he could access from Earth databases. He started with the basics, showing population charts and distribution maps and genetic records. Then he moved into the history of the extinction and recovery, explaining the timeline in detail. The assembled officials listened in silence. Some took notes on datapads. Others watched Luna, who had curled up at Jake's feet and fallen asleep, apparently finding galactic bureaucracy very boring. When Jake finished his initial presentation, Director Kester asked him to explain exactly how the Galactic Extinction Archive had come to contain such fundamentally incorrect information. Jake pulled up the rejection notices he had shown in class. These, he said, are automated responses from the archive system. Every update request from Earth gets flagged because we are a provisional member of the Galactic Council. Our scientific submissions do not have the same standing as those from full member worlds. They go into a secondary review queue that supposedly gets checked by actual analysts, but in practice seems to just sit there forever. A Vexian official asked how long this had been happening. Jake said that based on the records he could access, it had been at least 80 years since any significant updates to Earth data had been processed by the archive. The official looked shocked and turned to Director Kester, asking if this was really possible. The director's antennae twitched in what might have been embarrassment. She admitted that provisional member submissions did receive different handling than full member submissions. This was policy, she said, because provisional members were still learning proper scientific documentation standards. However, she acknowledged that an 80-year backlog suggested the system was not working as intended. Jake felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice level. With respect, Director, he said, Earth has been submitting documentation that meets or exceeds galactic standards for decades. The problem is not the quality of our submissions. The problem is that no one is actually looking at them. You have created a system that assumes provisional members must be wrong and then uses that assumption to justify ignoring everything they say. The room fell silent. Several officials shifted uncomfortably. A Krillian representative clicked something that the translator rendered as an expression of agreement. Director Kesther's compound eyes seemed to focus more intently on Jake, as if she was truly seeing him for the first time. Before anyone could respond, another human entered the room. Jake recognized her immediately and felt relief flood through him. Dr. Ryan Hayes was one of Earth's lead representatives to the Galactic Council, and she had been the driving force behind multiple rewilding initiatives. She apologized for being late and said she had caught the first transport from Earth. As soon as she heard what was happening, Dr. Hayes took a seat next to Jake, and Luna immediately woke up and moved to greet her. The older woman scratched the wolf behind the ears with the ease of long familiarity, and Luna leaned into the attention. Dr. Hayes looked around the table and said that she was glad this meeting was finally happening because Earth had been trying to have this conversation for a very long time. She pulled up her own data files and began presenting a much more comprehensive picture than Jake had been able to provide. The Great Restoration, she explained, had been one of humanity's defining achievements. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans understood their relationship to their planet's biosphere. In the span of 50 years, Earth had gone from environmental collapse to successful recovery of hundreds of ecosystems. But she continued all of that success meant nothing in galactic records. Earth was still being portrayed as a cautionary tale of environmental destruction. Students across the galaxy were being taught that humanity had failed to save species that were currently thriving. This was not just a matter of outdated information. It was damaging to Earth's reputation and to humanity's attempts to be taken seriously as environmental stewards. A Drellian official asked why this mattered so much. Dr. Hayes fixed him with a steady gaze and said that it mattered because perception shaped policy. Earth had been applying for full council membership for 30 years. Every application had been rejected, with concerns about humanity's environmental records cited as a major factor. How could that be fair when the environmental record being judged was decades out of date and fundamentally inaccurate? Director Kesther asked to see Earth's application history. Dr. Hayes provided it, and the room fell silent as officials reviewed the files. Application after application, and each one met with the same concerns about environmental responsibility and sustainability and whether humanity could be trusted with full member privileges. Jake watched Luna, who had returned to sleeping at his feet. He thought about his family's work in the Rockies, where wolf packs now roamed freely across thousands of acres of protected wilderness. He thought about the grizzly bears and the wolverines and the lynx that had all returned alongside the wolves. He thought about the rivers running clear and the forests growing thick and the entire web of life knitting itself back together because humans had decided to step back and let it heal. A young Trillian official asked a question that cut through the political discussion. She wanted to know how many other species Earth had recovered that were still listed as extinct. Dr. Hayes said that the exact number was difficult to determine without a full audit, but preliminary counts suggested at least 2. 147 species had been removed from Earth's own extinction lists but remained on the Galactic Archive as extinct. The number seemed to stun the assembled officials. Director Kessler asked if Dr. Hayes was certain, the human scientist that she was, and that she could provide detailed documentation for every single species. She added that this did not even account for species that had been incorrectly listed in the first place due to misidentification or incomplete surveys. The meeting continued for another 3 hours. Jake was asked hundreds of questions about wolf biology and behavior and conservation methods. Luna woke up several times to investigate interesting smells or to see if anyone had snacks to share. At one point, she charmed a Vexian official into playing a brief game of tug with her toy, and the sight of the dignified bureaucrat engaged in a pulling match with a wolf pup broke some of the formal tension in the room. By the end of the meeting, Director Kessler announced that a full formal investigation would be launched. The Galactic Extinction Archive would undergo a comprehensive audit starting with Earth's data, but eventually expanding to review all provisional member submissions. A dedicated verification team would be established to work directly with planetary governments on ensuring accurate ecological data. She looked at Jake and Dr. Hayes and said that this should have happened decades ago. The system had failed, and that failure was now being corrected. She thanked Jake for bringing Luna to class because, without that moment of chaos, this problem might have continued being ignored for another 80 years. As the meeting adjourned and officials began filing out, several approached Jake to meet Luna properly. The wolf was happy to receive attention and performed her full repertoire of cute behaviors, including the play bow and the head tilt and the trick, where she gently took treats from offered hands. A Krillian official who had been skeptical throughout the meeting knelt down to eye level with Luna and stared at her for a long moment before saying that she was indeed quite real and quite remarkable. Jake and Dr. Hayes walked back through the station corridors together with Luna trotting between them. The older scientist told Jake that he had done something important. The investigation moved quickly once it began, and what it uncovered made galactic headlines for weeks. The Galactic Extinction Archive was not just wrong about Earth. It was wrong about dozens of worlds. Provisional member submissions across the board had been systematically ignored and filed away and forgotten. Species thought lost were found thriving. Others confirmed extinct had never been properly documented. The entire system of ecological record-keeping that the galaxy had relied on for centuries turned out to be built on a foundation of bureaucratic neglect. But the investigation also triggered something Jake had not anticipated: a debate about whether humanity deserved credit for recovering species that humans had nearly destroyed in the first place. The argument spread across galactic networks and news programs and academic journals. It divided the council itself into camps that became more entrenched with each passing day. Jake found himself at the center of this storm. He received interview requests from hundreds of media outlets. Some wanted to celebrate Earth's conservation success. Others wanted to interrogate whether that success was genuine or just propaganda. Luna became a symbol for both sides of the debate. To some, she represented hope and redemption. To others, she was evidence that humanity could not be trusted because they had caused the problem they now claimed to have solved. The most vocal critic was Ambassador Thralvin, and a senior council member from the Nexian Confederacy. He gave a speech that was broadcast across the entire galactic network, arguing that Earth's provisional status existed for very good reasons. He pulled up historical records of human wars and pollution and environmental destruction. He showed images of extinct species that truly were gone forever: passenger pigeons and golden toads and Tasmanian tigers. He argued that a species that had caused such devastation could not simply be forgiven, because they had managed to save some of what they had nearly lost. Humanity, he said, should be judged by their worst failures, not their recent successes. The galaxy could not afford to give full membership to a species with such a reckless history. What would stop humans from repeating their mistakes on a galactic scale? What would prevent them from treating other worlds the way they had treated their own? The speech was powerful and persuasive. Many council members who had been sympathetic to Earth's case began to waver. Public opinion polls showed support for human membership dropping sharply. Jake watched the broadcast in his quarters with Luna beside him and felt a deep frustration building in his chest. Everything Ambassador Threlvan said was technically true. Humanity had done terrible things. But it was not the whole truth, and leaving out the rest of the story was its own kind of lie. Dr. Hayes called Jake 2 days later and told him that the council had agreed to hear a formal response. Earth would be given a chance to present its case before the full assembly. She asked Jake if he would be willing to speak and to bring Luna with him. Jake agreed immediately, even though the thought of addressing the entire Galactic Council made his stomach twist with anxiety. Day of the council session arrived, and Jake stood in a preparation room trying to calm his nerves. He had written and rewritten his speech a dozen times. Dr. Hayes had reviewed it and offered suggestions, but ultimately told him to speak from his heart, rather than trying to sound like a politician. Luna sensed his anxiety and pressed against his legs, trying to comfort him in the way that wolves do for their pack members. When the time came, Jake walked into the council chamber with Luna at his side. The space was enormous and circular, with seats rising in tiers around a central platform. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds filled those seats. The noise of their conversations was overwhelming until Director Kester called for order, and the chamber fell silent. Jake walked to the center platform. Luna stayed close to him with her ears swiveling as she took in all the sounds and smells of this strange place. A holographic projection system activated, and suddenly Jake and Luna were displayed, hundreds of times larger than life on screens, around the chamber so everyone could see them clearly. Director Kester introduced Jake and explained that he would be presenting Earth's response to the concerns raised by Ambassador Threlvan. She reminded the assembly to maintain decorum and to reserve questions until after the presentation was complete. Then she gestured to Jake, and the chamber fell silent again. Jake took a breath and began speaking. His voice sounded small at first, but the amplification system carried it clearly to every corner of the massive space. He started by thanking the council for the opportunity to speak and for conducting the investigation into the archive errors. Then he said something that seemed to surprise everyone, including himself. Ambassador Threlvan, he said, is right about almost everything. The chamber erupted in confused murmuring. Jake waited for quiet and continued. Humanity did drive wolves to extinction. We did hunt them and poison them and destroy their habitats. We did the same to hundreds of other species. We waged wars that devastated ecosystems. We polluted our air and water. We treated our planet like a resource to be exploited rather than a home to be cared for. All of that is true, and we do not deny it. He paused and looked down at Luna, who was sitting calmly despite the overwhelming sensory input of the massive chamber. But he said what Ambassador Threlvan left out is what happened next. What happened when we finally understood what we had done? What happened when an entire generation of humans looked at the damage and decided it was unacceptable? Jake pulled up images on the holographic display. Pictures of Earth from the 2060s showing smog-choked cities and dead rivers and clear-cut forests. Then pictures from the 2080s showing the first rewilding zones and the early success of vertical farming and the beginnings of ecosystem recovery. Then pictures from current day, showing thriving wilderness and clean cities and a planet that was healing. The Great Restoration did not happen by accident, he said. It happened because billions of humans made a choice. We chose to change everything about how we lived. We gave up conveniences and profits and the idea that nature existed to serve us. We redesigned our entire civilization around the principle of coexistence rather than domination. He told them about the collapse of industrial agriculture and how close humanity had come to total failure. He explained how that near catastrophe had forced a reckoning. People realized that they could not keep taking and expecting the planet to provide forever. The old systems broke and humanity had to build new ones or face extinction themselves. Vertical farms, he said, freed up 70% of the agricultural land that had been in use. That land was returned to wilderness, not as parks for human recreation, but as actual wild spaces where other species could live without human interference. Hunting was almost entirely eliminated, except for necessary population management. Pollution controls became so strict that many industries had to completely reinvent their processes. The global economy contracted for 2 decades because sustainability was prioritized over growth. It was not easy, Jake said, and his voice carried a weight that made the vast chamber feel somehow more intimate. My great-grandparents lived through the transition years. They told stories about rationing and shortages and social upheaval. People were angry and scared. There were protests and even some violence. But humanity held the course because the alternative was unacceptable. He gestured to Luna, who had gotten curious about the holographic displays and was trying to figure out if she could catch the projected images. Wolves became a symbol of that commitment. They represented everything humanity had almost lost. When the first reintroduction programs began, it was not just about saving one species. It was about proving that we could keep our promises, that we could give back what we had taken. Jake pulled up more data showing the cascade effects of wolf reintroduction. Elk populations came back into balance with available vegetation. Beaver populations exploded when trees grew back along rivers. Those beaver dams created wetlands that supported hundreds of other species. Birds returned. Fish populations recovered. Entire ecosystems rebuilt themselves around the presence of these apex predators. We learned, he said, that nature does not need us to manage it. It needs us to stop breaking it. The wolves taught us that. They taught us humility. They taught us that some things are more important than human convenience. A Vexian council member called out a question without waiting for the formal question period. She asked if humanity expected praise for fixing problems they had created. Jake shook his head and said no. We do not expect praise. We expect to be judged accurately. Ambassador Threlvan is right that we should be judged by our failures, but leaving out our successes is not justice. It is propaganda. He looked directly at where Ambassador Threlvan sat, and the alien met his gaze without flinching. Every species in this council, Jake said, has made mistakes. Every civilization has gone through periods of growth and learning and causing harm. The question is not whether we have failed. The question is whether we learned from those failures and changed our behavior. Earth has done that. We have proof. We have 247 species that your own records say are extinct, but are currently thriving on our world. The chamber was completely silent now. Jake felt Luna press against his leg, and he reached down to touch her head. The council deliberations took 6 weeks, and during that time the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath waiting for a decision. Jake tried to focus on his studies, but found it difficult to concentrate in classes, where he was now something between a celebrity and a controversial figure. Some students treated him like a hero. Others avoided him. Professor Velric had become one of his strongest supporters and had publicly argued that Earth deserved full membership, based on their demonstrated commitment to ecological restoration. Luna had adapted to station life with remarkable ease. She had become a fixture around the xenobiology department, and several professors had begun incorporating her into their lessons as a living example of successful conservation. She seemed to enjoy the attention, though Jake suspected she mostly just enjoyed the steady stream of treats that various students brought her. On the 43rd day after his council testimony, Jake received a message summoning him to a formal session. The council had reached their decision and would be announcing it publicly. He was requested to attend with Luna. Dr. Hayes arrived on the station that morning, and together they made their way to the council chamber. The gallery was packed with observers from across the galaxy. News crews had set up equipment to broadcast the session live. Jake took his assigned seat in the human delegation area with Luna at his feet. The Wolf seemed to sense the tension in the air and stayed close to him with her ears alert and her body pressed against his leg. Director Kester called the session to order, and the chamber fell silent. She began by summarizing the investigation into the Galactic Extinction Archive. The audit had revealed over 2,000 incorrect listings across dozens of worlds. Earth alone had 247 species incorrectly marked as extinct. The director acknowledged that this represented a systemic failure of the council's record-keeping processes and pledged that corrections were already underway. Then she moved to the question of Earth's membership status. She noted that the debate had been contentious and that council members held strong opinions on both sides. However, after reviewing all evidence and hearing testimony from multiple parties, the council had reached a majority decision. Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest. Luna looked up at him with concern, and he realized his hands were shaking. Dr. Hayes reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Director Kester announced that the Galactic Council had voted to grant Earth full membership status effective immediately. The chamber erupted in applause from some sections and grumbling from others. Jake felt tears spring to his eyes, and he bent down to hug Luna, who licked his face enthusiastically, seeming to understand that something good had happened. But the director was not finished. She raised her hands for quiet and continued speaking. In conjunction with this decision, she said the council was implementing a new verification protocol for ecological data submissions. This protocol would be known as the Mitchell Protocol, in honor of the human student whose actions had exposed the flaws in the previous system. The Mitchell Protocol established several key changes. First, all species status updates would receive immediate review, regardless of the submitting world's membership status. Second, a dedicated verification team would be established with representatives from both full and provisional member worlds. Third, any species listed as extinct would be subject to mandatory re-verification every 25 years to ensure accuracy. Fourth and finally, planetary governments would have direct communication channels with the verification team to report errors or submit new data without going through the automated systems that had failed so catastrophically. Jake listened in stunned silence as Director Kester outlined the protocol. He had hoped to correct the record about wolves. He had never imagined that his name would be attached to a galaxy-wide policy change. It felt overwhelming and humbling and more than a little terrifying. Director concluded by thanking Jake for his courage in speaking truth to the council and for refusing to accept incorrect information, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. She noted that Luna herself had become a symbol of hope across many worlds and that several other species recovery programs had received increased funding and attention in the wake of the Wolf's appearance at Prometheus 7. After the formal announcement ended, Jake was immediately surrounded by reporters and well-wishers and beings who wanted to pet Luna or take pictures with her. The Wolf handled it all with good grace, though Jake could tell she was getting tired of the attention. He managed to extract himself after an hour and made his way back to his quarters with Dr. Hayes and Luna Dodd once the door closed behind them. Jake collapsed onto his couch, and Luna immediately jumped up beside him. Dr. Hayes smiled and said that he had done something truly remarkable. The Mitchell Protocol would affect ecological conservation across the entire galaxy for generations to come. Jake said he still could not quite believe it was real. Over the following months, the changes became evident. The verification team began its work reviewing the entire extinction archive. Corrections were published weekly, and each one came with detailed documentation and acknowledgement of the error. Several provisional member worlds that had been struggling to have their voices heard suddenly found their submissions being taken seriously. Success stories of conservation and recovery began replacing the narratives of failure and loss. Jake was offered a position on the verification team upon completing his degree. It would mean staying at Prometheus 7 and working directly with the Council's Ecological Records Division. He accepted without hesitation. This was the work he wanted to do, and now he would have the chance to do it at a galactic scale. Luna, however, could not stay on the station permanently. She was growing quickly and would soon be too large and too energetic for station life. Jake knew she needed to return to Earth to join a breeding program where she could contribute to the species' recovery efforts. The decision to let her go was one of the hardest things he had ever done, but he knew it was right. The day came when Dr. Hayes arrived to take Luna back to Earth. Jake spent hours saying goodbye to the wolf who had changed his life so completely. Luna seemed confused about why her human was so sad, but she licked his tears and pressed against him, trying to offer comfort. When Dr. Hayes finally led her away, Luna looked back at Jake with those amber eyes, and he felt his heart break just a little. But the story did not end there. 6 months later, Jake received word that Luna had given birth to a healthy litter of 5 pups. The breeding program wanted to know if he would be interested in raising one of them as part of an experimental program to introduce wolves to controlled environments outside Earth. The goal was to see if wolves could adapt to space station life and potentially contribute to conservation education across the galaxy. Jake said yes immediately, and 8 weeks later a transport arrived carrying a small gray pup with silver-tipped fur and bright amber eyes. He named her Ghost after the way she seemed to move silently through his quarters when she was exploring. She was Luna's daughter, and she had her mother's friendly curiosity and gentle temperament. Ghost became the first wolf to be permanently raised in space. She attended classes with Jake and met beings from dozens of worlds. She became a living ambassador for Earth's conservation efforts and for the principle that extinction did not have to be forever if people were willing to fight for recovery. Jake eventually finished his degree and took the permanent position with the verification team. His work took him to worlds across the galaxy, helping planetary governments establish accurate ecological records and develop conservation programs based on Earth's successes. Ghost went with him on many of these trips, and her presence always seemed to soften difficult conversations. It was hard to maintain skepticism about humanity's commitment to conservation when a living wolf was sitting in the room wagging her tail. 5 years after that first day in Professor Velrick's classroom, Jake found himself giving a tour of Earth's rewilding zones to a group of Galactic Council dignitaries. They stood on a ridge in the northern Rockies, looking out over thousands of acres of protected wilderness. In the valley below, a wolf pack was visible moving through the snow following the tracks of an elk herd. Ambassador Threlvan was part of the delegation, and he stood beside Jake, watching the wolves in silence for a long time. Finally, he said that he had been wrong to judge humanity solely on their failures. He had not understood that true strength was not in never falling, but in getting back up and choosing to do better. The wolves, he said, were proof that redemption was possible, not just for individual beings, but for entire species. Jake thanked him for saying so. He pointed out the different wolves in the pack below, explaining their relationships and behaviors. That large gray male, he said, was the alpha. The smaller brown female beside him was his mate. The yearlings playing in the snow were their offspring from the previous year. The pack was healthy and thriving, and their presence had triggered cascading positive effects throughout the entire ecosystem. Another dignitary asked about the challenges of maintaining the wolf population. Jake explained that it required constant work. Conflicts with livestock still happened and had to be managed carefully. Habitat protection required ongoing political will. Education progress